Right, let's dive straight into Parmenides. The text kicks off by highlighting a core idea. If physical objects are just figments of our personal imagination or acceptance, then blurring the lines between psychological states and spatial events becomes not just possible, but almost inevitable. Think about it. If reality is subjective anyway, why not see your thoughts as shaping the world, or the world shaping your thoughts? This kind of fluidity echoes Plato later on, though Parmenides doesn't quite deny the natural world existence as much as he questions its objective status. And crucially, his narrative isn't meant to be taken as simple allegory. It's more like a symbolic or mythical map to understanding being. Now, that famous prologue, the journey to the goddess, was it a genuine mystical experience, a revelation? Or was it all carefully crafted imagery, maybe borrowing from Pythagorean apocalyptic poems, as Diels suggested? Well, the text leans towards the latter being part of the picture. Those symbolic elements feel constructed. But here's the kicker. They're fused together so powerfully appealing, both intellectually and emotionally, that it's hard to believe Parmenides would have written it in verse if it wasn't reporting something real, something visionary. So we should probably read it as describing how he experienced his own philosophical awakening, the path to nous, mind, or understanding. But crucially, this prologue describes the approach to that state. The actual most authentic visionary experience for Parmenides is the intellectual contemplation of being itself. That's the payoff. The destination reached through that journey described in the poem. So who did Parmenides learn from? There's this tradition, citing Plato, saying he was Xenophanes' pupil. Maybe they met, maybe Xenophanes was old then. But the text suggests closer ties to the Pythagoreans. Still, Xenophanes' influence is undeniable, especially in the language Parmenides uses to describe being's unchanging nature. Think of Xenophanes' hymns to God. But here's where Parmenides really steps up. Xenophanes, while believing God was the best guess based on morality, ultimately said humans can only have belief, not true knowledge, about the divine. Parmenides flips this. He argues that if you analyze what you mean by assertion by is, the characteristic Xenophanes gave to God, immutability, completeness, etc., must apply necessarily to any transcendent subject. And guess what? That subject is the only thing that could possibly be known. So, far from denying human knowledge, Parmenides affirms it, and this allows him to redefine right belief, not as Xenophanes' vague moral fit, but as belief that aligns with the truth, however imperfectly we grasp it. Okay, moving on to the Ionian scientists, the Milesians, Anaximenes, Heraclitus. Parmenides doesn't mince words. In Fragment 5, he basically calls them out. You guys believe in a sensible reality, but you can't make any clear, necessary statements about it. Why? Because you don't grasp the limitations of the sensible world. They're stuck before even reaching the goddess, as the text puts it. His target isn't just the average Joe. Fragments 5 and 8 point fingers specifically at those who think reality is one underlying substance or form. Think Anaximenes with his air changing by condensation and rarefaction, or Heraclitus with his logos and flux. Parmenides argues that if something changes, it both is and isn't itself in that process. Only Anaximander seems to escape this critique, because his infinite principle isn't really a substance in the same way. It's radically different from the things it generates. Interestingly, Parmenides does adopt Anaximander's idea of a spherical cosmos, showing he was still engaging with contemporary scientific thought, even as he radically reinterpreted its foundations. Let's talk Pythagoras. The text is clear. Parmenides was deeply influenced both by the Pythagorean philosophy and their way of life. You see hints of the Pythagorean lifestyle sprinkled throughout the poem. The chariot ride in the prologue, maybe the view of the physical world as a kind of prison, Tartarus, seeing birth as hateful, and presenting himself as a learner rather than a teacher. On the theoretical side, ideas like the reality being determinate, not indefinite like the Pythagorean apeiron, a dualistic view of the cosmos, and perhaps the universe governed by a ring of fire or light, these all echo Pythagorean thought. But Parmenides wasn't just a carbon copy. There are subtle critiques embedded too. For instance, linking male to cold and female to warm, fragment 12 note, sounds like Pythagorean numerology or cosmology, but might represent a challenge. And his arguments against the reality of empty space, intro note to fragment 7, and time fragment 8 notes, push beyond standard Pythagorean views, showing a critical engagement. All right, the heart of the matter, Parmenides' investigation into being. His whole project rests on this conviction. Humans can know reality nous. This fuels his apocalyptic-style poem, which is basically an attempt to figure out what must reality be like if we can know it. And what's the deal with our everyday experience? The core of his argument lies in the two ways of inquiry. He presents two paths to discovering reality. Path 1, the way of truth, defined by the cryptic phrase, is and is not for not being. Path 2, the way of opinion, defined by is not and must needs not be. The key insight? These two paths are mutually exclusive and cover everything. There's no third option. The test, the criterion, is this. If something is real, it must either be something intrinsically, or it must necessarily not be anything. Since the second path leads to nothingness, reality must lie on the first path. So, the task is to figure out what can be the subject of an unconditional is. Now Parmenides throws down the gauntlet with these terms, is and is not, but he doesn't explicitly define them. This has tripped up modern readers sometimes, thinking he meant exists in the existential sense, or just that he was fuzzy on language. But the text suggests a better reading. Parmenides is doing pure formal logic, dialectics. He's not assuming a specific meaning for is, he's asking. Given that we use is to assert and think, what must its meaning be in order for thought to be coherent? He deliberately isolates is and is not in defining the two ways, stripping away subjects and predicates. His goal is twofold. First, identify what can be said to be without contradiction, and second, figure out what further properties can be attributed to that subject. Then, he cleverly converts the verb is into the noun being. Suddenly, the definition of the way becomes the copula in a statement about being. Being is ungenerated, imperishable, and so on. It's a brilliant logical move. So Parmenides identifies being as unique, indivisible, great. But then he starts piling on predicates: ungenerated, imperishable, complete, unique, unvarying. How does this work? If being is one, how can it have multiple properties without those properties becoming other beings? Parmenides sidesteps this by treating these predicates not as separate attributes, but as alternative names for being itself. Think of it like calling Socrates the philosopher or the Athenian. They're different descriptions, but refer to the same person. Plato clearly understood this, as did later thinkers like Eudemus, who credits Plato with first distinguishing the two uses of is, the substantial is of being, and the attributive is of participation. Even the Megarians, seen as later Eleatics, operated on this idea of predication as identification. Aristotle confirms this. Parmenides used only one sense of being, leading him to conclude that anything other than being couldn't truly be. So the is connecting being to its properties signifies identity. The predicate isn't something added to being, it is being viewed from a different aspect. This leads to a fascinating paradox. Parmenides uses undefined terms like being and is to build up their meaning. It's almost like Plato's impure dialectic, using the appearance of contradiction to reveal deeper truth. In Parmenides' ontology, the very act of making true assertions about being using is in a way phenomenal, like making empirical claims, but it's also the only way to touch reality. Here's the paradox. Humans, our experiences, the sensible world, all of it, according to Parmenides, is ultimately unreal, like a dream of a shadow. Yet, somehow we are capable of this profound illumination, this knowledge of being. The poet Pindar nails this tension perfectly in his verses quoted here. Creatures of a day, what is anyone? What is he not? A dream of a shadow, that is what men are. But when God-given splendor comes, a brilliant light shines on men. It captures the fleeting, illusory nature of human existence, alongside the possibility of transcendent vision. Parmenides dropped a bombshell. Its impact was immediate and massive. How do we know? Because almost everyone tried to dodge it. Look at the big names of the 5th century: Empedocles, Anaxagoras, the atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, even the relativist Protagoras. They all felt the heat from Parmenides' arguments against the reality of the sensible world. Their systems, in various ways, were attempts to find a way back, to re-establish the reality of the changing, diverse world we experience, often by building it out of non-sensible components. It was a direct response to Parmenides' challenge. Let's look at Empedocles first. He's interesting because he seems to accept Parmenides' core points about physics. He agrees that you can't have one single substance changing into another, and he buys Parmenides' analysis of coming to be and perishing as just combinations and separations of unchanging stuff. But where he differs is crucial. He gives these underlying elements real, substantial being. They aren't just abstract possibilities, they are. His cosmology involves cycles. Sometimes the universe is a single homogeneous sphere, the divine state, and sometimes it breaks down into the 4 elements: earth, water, air, fire, forming the sensible world we know. So Empedocles keeps Parmenides' unique eternal being, sphere for phase, but sacrifices its timelessness. Reality is unified but not eternally so. Then you have Leucippus and Anaxagoras taking a different tack. Leucippus, the supposed founder of atomism, directly challenges Parmenides on two fronts. First, he brings back empty space, which Parmenides had banished. Second, he populates this void with an infinite number of indivisible particles, atoms. These atoms are like Parmenides' being, they're full, indivisible, eternal, but they move, they have size, and there are infinitely many of them in infinite variety. Crucially, Leucippus explicitly says empty space not being can also be. He accepts Parmenides' principle, but denies its conclusion about not being's impossibility. Anaxagoras takes a subtler route. He sticks with Parmenides, no empty space, the world is full. Using Parmenides' logic, if something is, it can't not be. He argues there can't be a smallest particle, so nothing can be separated or come into being by itself. Instead, he posits an infinite number of infinitely small seeds of everything. Hair comes from hair seeds, flesh from flesh seeds. These seeds are always mixed together, never truly separated. Only mind knows is truly separate, like Parmenides' being. Both Leucippus and Anaxagoras try to salvage a pluralistic reality within Parmenides' framework, but they do so by multiplying the fundamental units indefinitely. And then there's Protagoras, the famous relativist. You might think he'd be irrelevant here, but actually, his reaction to Parmenides is quite telling. He completely rejected the possibility of scientific or philosophical knowledge, wanting to kick it out of education altogether. He even claimed the old title sage, sophistes, positioning himself against the Pythagoreans, who said only God had wisdom. Porphyry says he explicitly fought against Eleatic monism. How? Well, his famous agnosticism about the gods, Fragment 1, directly counters Parmenides' claim that only the eternal is knowable, and his principle that you can assert opposite things about the same subject, Fragment 6a, seems to stem directly from Parmenides' analysis of the physical world's contradictions. If Parmenides showed the sensible world was problematic because it involved both being and not being, Protagoras took that further, arguing that language and convention are all we have, since Parmenides himself seemed to imply the physical world lacked objective reality outside our experience. What about the supposed direct followers? Zeno of Elea, Parmenides' own student, seems to have focused solely on defending his master's position, particularly against critics. According to Plato, Zeno wrote a book specifically aimed at refuting those who thought Parmenides' monism was absurd, by showing that belief in the sensible world led to even more contradictions. Plutarch praises Zeno for keeping Parmenides' argument intact, even though he failed politically. Melissus, another Samian, is trickier. Aristotle calls him a bit crude compared to Parmenides. He accepted most of Parmenides' points about the sensible world being flawed and reality being one, unchanging, immobile, indivisible. But he diverged significantly. He conceived of this reality as extended and infinite, though non-physical. He tried to deduce unity from infinity, focusing more on the material aspect of unity, unlike Parmenides, who seemed concerned with the unity of essence or form. Now, let's zoom in on Plato. The text highlights how the dialogues Theaetetus, Sophist, Statesman, and Parmenides form a kind of sequence and Eleatic tetralogy. Why put the initial formulation of the theory of forms in the mouth of young Socrates talking to Parmenides and Zeno in the Parmenides? And why replace Socrates in the later dialogues with an unorthodox Eleatic visitor? This isn't just random casting. Plato, as always, is more interested in philosophical lineage than strict historical accuracy. He's exploring how the ideas developed, interacted, and were critiqued. The setting of the Parmenides is key. It places the origin of the forms firmly in the mid-5th century context, right after Parmenides. So, in the Parmenides, Plato shows Socrates grappling with Zeno's arguments against the many. Zeno said things that cannot be many. Socrates counters, okay, maybe the sensible things are many, but the forms, the likes, the unlikes, the ones, the manis, these are individual intelligibles. Each form is perfectly itself, never changing, and cannot be its opposite. These forms are the real causes of why sensible things appear the way they do. Importantly, these forms, according to Socrates here, possess the very same characteristics Parmenides attributed to being, ungenerated, imperishable, etc. So Plato presents the theory of forms not as a rejection of Parmenides, but as a sophisticated pluralist development of it. The method Socrates uses, hypothesis, contradiction, is clearly derived from Zeno, and ultimately from Parmenides himself. Even the account in the Phaedo of how Socrates discovered the forms by abandoning search in the sensible world and turning to discussion's logos resonates with this Eleatic background. But Plato doesn't just copy Parmenides. He makes a crucial distinction, the first in philosophy, between the attributive is, as in the man is sitting, and the identifying is, as in the man is a man. Parmenides, remember, treated predicates like unlike as just alternative names for being. Socrates points out that the unlike cannot be like is ambiguous. Does the unlike mean the quality of unlikeness, or the things that are unlike? By distinguishing these, Socrates allows particulars to participate in forms without collapsing into Parmenides' monism. He keeps the principle of contradiction, nothing is both X and not X, but applies it differently. The form beauty is always beautiful. A beautiful thing participates in beauty but isn't identical to it. This allows Plato to retain the Eleatic rigor, while giving sensible things a foothold in reality through participation, something Parmenides and Zeno denied them. Fast forward to the Sophist. Here Plato gets even more explicit. He reviews earlier ontologies, including a pluralist theory he attributes to friends of the forms. Guess what? It sounds exactly like the theory in the Phaedo and Republic. And get this, Plato explicitly groups the theory of forms with Parmenides' ontology, criticizing both for saying everything is at rest. This is huge. It shows Plato sees his own system as deeply connected to and reacting against Eleatic thought. To drive this home, he centers the dialogue around a visiting Eleatic philosopher, someone dedicated to the form of being. This visitor represents the ideal dialectician, constantly questioning, always aiming for being. Plato, even here, positions himself as a direct, if critical, heir to Parmenides, now ready to dissect the very concept of being he once seemed to accept. Plato's direct critique of Parmenides' monism in the Sophist is intense. He hammers home the point that Parmenides said, "The all is one." Plato's strategy is to ask, okay, what do you even mean by being when you say it's one? First, he attacks the uniqueness. If all things are one single thing, then only that one thing has being. But does being mean the same thing as one? Parmenides says yes. But if the names are different from the thing, you have two things. If the name is the thing, the name is just a name of nothing. It's a mess. Second, he tackles wholeness. Parmenides compares being to a sphere, implying it has parts, center, edges. But if it has parts, it's a whole of parts, not the indivisible one. Either way, Parmenides seems stuck. Plato's conclusion? The many predicates Parmenides piles onto being, ungenerated, etc., can't just be different names for one thing. They must be names of separate substances like being itself, which particulars can participate in or suffer. This problem Parmenides created, how to predicate without multiplying beings, wasn't entirely new. Aristotle mentions earlier thinkers, like Lycophron, who were wrestling with it too. They worried about saying one thing is many things. Some tried workarounds, like removing the verb is man fair or paraphrasing man has fairness. Plato himself criticizes similar moves in the Sophist and Phaedo, arguing against people who forbade saying good of man because it violates the one cannot be many rule. Even the Megarian Stilpo clung to this view in the 4th century. So, Plato's theory of forms wasn't just reacting to Parmenides, it was a direct solution to this logical puzzle, Parmenides himself inadvertently highlighted by treating predicates as mere names. Eudemus later credited Plato specifically with solving this by distinguishing the two uses of is, the attributive and the substantial, a distinction clearly foreshadowed in the Parmenides. Now, Aristotle steps in with his own critique, primarily in the physics. He targets Parmenides' monism head-on. Aristotle argues Parmenides implicitly assumed being and unity had only one meaning. First, Aristotle dismantles this assumption. Being for Aristotle has multiple senses, categories, and Parmenides' one being doesn't fit neatly into any of them. Unity also has multiple senses, continuous versus indivisible, limited versus unlimited, and Parmenides' conception is too vague. He dismisses the attempts to avoid ambiguity by fiddling with the word is. Then Aristotle attacks the argument itself, calling it aristical, relying on fallacies. He argues Parmenides failed to grasp that what's shared by many things, like being human, has a distinct but not separate being, Plato's distinction again. Aristotle rejects Parmenides' logic. If being is the only thing that is, how can predicates apply? Either they name other things, introducing not being, or they are just different names for being, making being ambiguous. Ultimately, Aristotle concludes Parmenides' being, even if non-spatial, can't be indivisible, because we can only conceive of being as a genus, which logically implies species. Interestingly, in the Metaphysics, Aristotle seems a bit more sympathetic, acknowledging the difficulty of Parmenides' position. He admits that if being and unity are substances, it's hard to see how anything else could exist. He even praises Parmenides earlier for focusing on the unity of essence or form, seeing his conclusion that there's only one thing, being, as a sign of insight. The summary of Parmenides' view by the Peripatetics, what's other than being is not. Not being is nothing, seems to capture the core of Parmenides' denial of being to anything other than the one, especially as expressed in Fragment 8, where he argues that things that come to be or change have no being alongside being. However, Aristotle still maintains that Parmenides' being, while unique, cannot be indivisible, as it must be a genus. Moving into the Hellenistic and Roman periods, Parmenides pops up again, this time for the skeptics. Figures like Arcesilaus and Carneades claimed him as an ancestor, along with Xenophanes and Zeno. Arcesilaus's famous practice of arguing both sides of an issue, refusing to commit, clearly echoes Zeno's dialectical method, which stems directly from Parmenides' physical dualism and his characterization of humans as knowing nothing. Plutarch and Cicero explicitly mention Parmenides as someone Arcesilaus and Carneades invoked to justify their suspension of judgment. Timon, in his satirical poem, even puts words straight out of Parmenides into the mouth of Xenophanes. He laments failing to achieve complete skepticism, being deceived by a treacherous path away from total doubt, using language like looking in both directions and ended up. That's pure Parmenides. So even the skeptics, in their quest for radical uncertainty, found an unexpected ally in the father of metaphysical certainty. The Stoics, however, seem to have missed the boat, according to Sextus Empiricus. Their interpretation of the prologue looks pretty superficial. Sidonius, though, recognized Parmenides' significance in the history of geography, suggesting he grasped the seriousness of his physics. Others, like Favorinus and Galen, also show awareness. Plutarch even defends Parmenides against Epicurus' critic Colotes, who apparently slandered Parmenides as having abolished everything: fire, water, cities, making life impossible. Plutarch pushes back, emphasizing Parmenides' systematic, positive cosmology, arguing that Parmenides didn't eliminate sensible or intelligible nature, but rather assigned each its proper domain. It's a valiant defense, though perhaps missing the deeper ontological critique Aristotle raised. Then comes Neoplatonism, where serious interest in Parmenides flares up again. Plotinus sees Parmenides being as closely related to Plato's one mind. He understands Parmenides' talk of being altogether or in contact with itself, as illustrating how being encompasses everything, including the act of knowing. Plotinus distinguishes Parmenides' being from Plato's ultimate one, seeing Parmenides as closer to the level of the eternal life while Plato goes beyond. He acknowledges that Parmenides himself in the poem didn't make this fine distinction, which is why Plato and Zeno critiqued him for making the one many. Syrianus, Plotinus' successor, follows suit, accepting this identification of Parmenides' being with Plato's one being, while still noting the difference from the absolute one. Proclus, Syrianus' student, takes this further, trying to find Plato even more explicitly in Parmenides. He quotes Fragments suggesting Parmenides thought being was plural, and then argues Parmenides actually believed in a plurality of intelligibles ordered by the one being. Hold on. That's basically attributing a version of the theory of forms to Parmenides. Proclus even misreads the sphere comparison, paraphrasing it as Parmenides affirming the spherical form of the one, and later describing the knowing belonging to being as spherical motion. He's clearly trying to assimilate Parmenides to his own Neoplatonic system. Despite these errors, Proclus shows he knew the text well and recognized Parmenides' historical and philosophical weight. Ammonius Hermanaeus, Proclus's pupil, doesn't add much, and his pupils seem to have relied on second-hand info, quoting Parmenides incorrectly. Simplicius, however, provides the fullest account since Aristotle. He includes a discussion of the Platonic and Aristotelian critiques, characterizing Plato's approach as coming from a higher, more articulated intellectual order. He suggests Aristotle's logical divisions don't quite apply to Parmenides' being. He wisely treats the sphere comparison as poetic imagery, avoiding Proclus's mistake there. However, Simplicius still falls into the trap of seeing Parmenides' predicates as names of separate forms. Interestingly, he mistakenly claims Parmenides actually made the subject-attribute distinction, contrasting it with the Megarians, and attributes this to Parmenides' early date. Overall, Simplicius shows clearer understanding than most before him, but still wrestles with interpreting Parmenides accurately. So, wrapping up, Parmenides remains a towering figure. His relentless focus on the nature of being, his use of rigorous dialectic, and his bold assertion that logic trumps sensory experience set the stage for virtually all subsequent metaphysics. The puzzles he created, especially around the unity of being and the nature of predication, kept thinkers like Plato and Aristotle busy, and his shadow looms large even in later traditions like Neoplatonism. He truly kicked off a philosophical conversation that continues to this day.